Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Dudley. I'm the co-director of InSight Crime. This is a diagram made by the U.S. Treasury Department in 2012. It depicts a money laundering organization in Guatemala. The person you see at the top of this pyramid is a Guatemalan national named Marjorie Chacon Russell. For a long time, she described herself as a businesswoman. She was in reality a tremendous fixer for the underworld, connecting drug traffickers, money launderers, and politicians who needed one another for various reasons. One of her main connections was another person on this chart, Hayden Eduardo Burallo Blasmibat, alias El Oso, the bear. Burallo was a fixer himself, as well as a drug trafficker and a money launderer. For a long time, he brought in cocaine from Colombia that he sold at about $12,000 per kilo to the Zetas criminal organization from Mexico, who were then operating in Guatemala. Burallo's wife, Mirza Silvana Hernandez de Burallo, is next to him on the chart. She was the front person for Burallo's companies, which included a lottery, a great way to move cash in illicit ways. According to numerous officials in the U.S. and Guatemala, Marjorie and Mirza had a long-time relationship with former Vice President Roxana Baldetti and were laundering money for the then VP, who was involved in multiple corruption and possibly drug trafficking schemes. Mirza, officials told me, attended Baldetti's 50th birthday party and was also the conduit through which her husband allegedly passed a suitcase of cash to the Patriot Party for its 2011 presidential campaign, which Baldetti and Otto Perez Molina won. After their victory, Baldetti and Perez Molina set up what can only be called a mafia state, in which they employed various parts of the government to service corruption and criminal schemes. The goal, as has become clear from the numerous Guatemalan investigations, assisted by the United Nations-backed International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, also known as CICIG, and most recently the US government, was to make as much money as possible while running the government. Those who benefited were people who were participating directly in these criminal and corruption schemes, including both the campaign contributors and their operatives in the government, such as then Interior Minister Mauricio López Bonilla. But there were also indirect beneficiaries, judicial operatives, politicians, lawyers, and many others. In 2014, for instance, the Baldetti-Perez Molina wing greased the wheels of this mafia state and made sure that then Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz would not continue in the post, placing instead someone who they believed was an ally. They also rigged the elections for the high courts, controlled who became comptroller, set up their people in the tax administration and customs offices. But they overestimated their power and reach. And people who they thought were their allies began to see that things were changing, especially as it related to the international pressure from both the CICIG and the United States to right judicial wrongs. New Attorney General Thelma Aldana, working with the CICIG, began to develop corruption cases that reached the top of the government. Independent judges took positions in high-impact courts where sensitive cases could be heard. And Marjorie Chacon, yes, the same Marjorie Chacon that I mentioned at the outset, made a critical decision to hand herself over to U.S. authorities. The year was 2012, and Chacon sought to, as she told her lawyer at the time, clean up her affairs with the U.S. But the Treasury Department was just the tip of the iceberg of Chacon's problems. The Drug Enforcement Administration was also looking into her activities, and so the DEA and Chacon made a deal. I will help you prosecute drug traffickers in the region, she told them, if you lower my sentence, help me legalize some of my earnings, and get my family out of the country. A deal struck. The DEA installed cameras and listening devices in her Guatemala house and told her to, quote, just keep doing what you do, unquote. And over the next several months, Chacon became what one DEA agent told me was one of the most effective informants in recent memories, helping to corral suspects from Mexico to Colombia and nearly all points in between. Among them were, if last week's U.S. indictment of former Vice President Baldetti and former Interior Minister López Bonilla are to be believed, two of the highest level officials involved in Guatemala's Mafia State. For his part, López Bonilla had assigned a 15 to 20 person security detail to Chacon, even though by his own admission, he did not know that she was a DEA informant. He also met with Chacon at her house, where in clear view of the cameras the DEA had installed, he accepted several stacks of cash to protect another Guatemalan trafficker. This may have permanently sunk him, even if he gets out on the corruption charges he is facing in Guatemala. Chacon also played a key role in the downfall of Baldetti. In early 2014, she lured her ally Borrayo to travel to Paris for what he thought would be an amorous encounter. Instead, French authorities pounced, arresting him and shipping him to the U.S. to face charges. Mirza, his wife, followed him to the U.S. shortly thereafter, and it is thought that their testimonies are at the heart of the accusation against former Vice President Baldetti. What's my analysis? First, we should mention that in this story, neither Baldetti nor López Bonilla, nor Otto Pérez Molina, for that matter, have yet to be convicted. Nonetheless, by all appearances, it seems as if they represent what we have come to call a mafia state. I don't use that term lightly. In fact, I rarely use that term because overuse can water down its impact. I would say mafia state is one in which the state has become a vessel for the interests of organized crime and corruption. That this is a top-down structure, that it happens in a systematic manner, and that it happens over a prolonged period of time. In the case of the Otto Pérez Molina presidency, the state was clearly a vessel. The administration sought to obtain control of all the nodes of power and the ability to thwart justice in order to enrich themselves. This was a top-down structure as well, run from the presidency, with tribute from those operators who were making money in their own schemes. López Bonilla, for instance, is being investigated for contracting everything in the Interior Ministry, from toilet paper to security cameras to vehicles to third parties who had some connection with him, so he could reap some of the benefits of these contracts. Then, according to a Guatemalan attorney general in CICIG case, he would kick up some of the proceeds to the top. That is obviously systematic as well as top-down. Finally, this occurred over many years, so it was prolonged. Not every corruption scheme or organized crime scheme that involves state actors makes for a mafia state, but by all appearances, and by the cases playing out in the Guatemalan and now U.S. justice systems, the Otto Pérez Molina administration was a mafia state. I'm Stephen Dudley, and this is InSight Crime. You're watching InSight Crime's weekly Facebook Live, in which we talk current events and analyze trends in organized crime in the Americas. We're also taking your questions and comments, doing our best to answer them in a timely and orderly fashion. Today we have senior editor David Gagne with us. David, how you doing?
Hey Steve, I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good to have you. Good to have you. We're both speaking to you from Colombia, which is actually our headquarters. So happy to have David. David, any initial thoughts on our main topic of the day, this Guatemalan mafia state?
Yeah, obviously this is the topic that we've been covering a lot over the years. But as I heard you kind of give this explanation overview of the Pérez Molina administration, it made me think back to, I once heard that apartheid was basically perfect racism. And I feel like what the Pérez Molina administration set up with the mafia state in Guatemala, you could consider perfect corruption, if that made sense. It wasn't something that was done on the side. It was something that was, systematically sanctioned. It involved multiple levels of government actors, and it was something, as you said, that happened over a course of many years. Obviously, corruption in Guatemala didn't start with Perez Molina, and as someone who's been covering this a lot longer than I have, I was wondering how you distinguish between the corruption that we saw under Perez Molina and past administrations in Guatemala.
Oh, I'm sorry. You couldn't hear me? I apologize. I had my microphone off. So yes, I like where you started with that. This whole idea of perfect corruption, this idea where you had them controlling all of these levels that they needed to control. So first, they needed to control all the aspects that would ensure that their revenue streams, in this case, corruption revenue schemes, were coming in, were flowing in. So what did they do? Well, they controlled, the customs and border agency. That's the case that's playing out right now, and that has ensnared the former president and vice president, as well as many others. But they also needed to control other aspects. So they needed to control the Ministry of the Interior, and the Ministry of the Interior was critical because that controls all the police agencies. And really is the entity that could start many investigations. They needed to control the tax services, the way in which that would allow them to ensure that any sort of discrepancies that people were seeing on the books could be accounted for, and could also include other revenue-making schemes. In other words, if you're lowering taxes for certain activities, well, then you could be getting kickbacks as well from that. They needed to control the judicial system. So let's scheme to control the Attorney General's office. Let's scheme to control the high courts. So just the amazingly layered way in which they covered all of their bases, except for some very crucial nodes. And it was almost like a supra-international elite, really, that has pushed them into the courts, because it's hard to say whether or not if the Attorney General's office in Guatemala had if they didn't have the CICIG, if they didn't have the backing of the U.S. government, whether or not we'd be seeing any of these cases. So it is. So in that regard, maybe that scheme would still be going, or some facsimile thereof. And as you pointed out in your question, I mean, maybe there were versions of this scheme that were going on before they came to power. I think the difference between this particular administration and previous administrations was the levels to which they would go to control all these different nodes, create all these different revenue streams, and the amount of money that they were asking for. The notion that we are getting from investigators in these cases is that instead of asking for maybe a traditional 15-20% kickback, they were talking about 30 or 40%. So in a way, maybe it was just they angered their longtime partners. So it's hard to know what fleshed this particular scheme out into the open, but it may have been a combination of things. This presence of international actors who were putting pressure on them, along with their level of greed, and the fact that they had co-opted so many pieces of the state.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the CICIG, it's kind of hard to talk about this without talking about the CICIG and how important of a role it's played. But again, the CICIG was around for many years before it uncovered what it uncovered with in terms of the Mafia State. Do you think something changed within the CICIG, or do you think something changed within the Attorney General's office that enabled all of this to come to the light?
It, I think that the CSIG certainly, of course, both things definitely changed. I think the CSIG is something that we look at now and say this is a success story. But I think for many years that was a question mark. I think it took many years for the CSIG to understand what its role was, get the kind of leverage that it needed within institutions that were working perhaps much better than they were when the CSIG initially arrived, in order to have the results that it's had. So I think it's a combination of both. The Attorney General's office has made huge leaps since the CSIG arrived. There have been a number of new tools put in their tool chest, so to say, including the ability to have cooperating witnesses or use of wiretaps. Those sorts of things didn't exist when the CSIG arrived, and so they are playing with a much better set of tools, and they've learned how to do these things in a way that is much more, I would say, forensic rather than dependent on testimonials. So they've been able to use much more evidence that is harder to refute, and that has taken it out of the hands of politicians and judicial actors who may have been corrupted. So if it's in human hands, so to say, it is more easily corruptible than if it's in sort of scientific hands. So if you have telephone calls in which different actors in a corruption scheme are talking about the corruption scheme on a telephone call, it's very hard to refute. And then you use that information to then all of a sudden you can use that information to get cooperating witnesses. And then once you get cooperating witnesses, it kind of cascades from there. And I think that that's what they found is their winning formula to get these cases to trial, because as I pointed out in the intro section, they haven't prosecuted these cases. Certainly the U.S. indictment of last week brings to the fore the question, is the U.S. worried about whether or not these people will be convicted in Guatemala? I'm not sure whether you had the same take.
Yeah, I mean that was my first reaction when I heard about that. And like you said, I mean none of them they've cracked the case, but they haven't sealed the deal. They haven't convicted anyone. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if the United States is worried about whether or not the Attorney General's office will be able to do that. On the other hand, as you said, it does seem like they've built pretty strong cases, unassailable in terms of how much evidence they've collected. So if the U.S. is worried about that, they're not worried about how much data and how much information the Guatemalans are collecting, but rather what other types of forces are preventing them from being completed.
These are two different cases, obviously, too. I mean, one is a corruption case. These are corruption cases that the vice president and the president are facing there in Guatemala, as well as the former interior minister, and then drug trafficking cases in the United States. I think the other thing that jumped out at me with the drug trafficking case was that it dated 2010. That predates their entry into office. So while we may talk about a mafia state, technically they weren't part of the mafia state, or at least they didn't have the type of top-down control that I think really defines a mafia state until a couple of years later. I don't know if that also jumped out at you, but in 2010, that's when the conspiracy, according to the U.S. indictment anyway, starts.
Yeah, and the other thing is, it wasn't before they took office, so it wasn't that they were facilitating drug shipments. They were actually the ones moving them, which is not the usual way that these cases are laid out in the U.S.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, no, and so the thought was if they had this kind of top-down scheme and they were just collecting quotas, so to say, from the actors in the top-down scheme, that's different from being participants in the scheme. The indictment seems to be saying that they were active participants in the scheme. So, so very, very telling indeed. It would be interesting. They may never have the trial in the U.S. I mean, they may just get condemned and sentenced in Guatemala, and who knows? Maybe they never face trial in the U.S. Or even if they are extradited, they will do what most people who are extradited do, which is cooperate. Which is exactly what Marjorie Chacon and Mirza and her husband, Borallo, are clearly doing. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. Maybe we could have a look at those.
Yeah.
I'll just we got one from Luis Pinto. Says, what will happen with the CICIG after Thelma Aldana? Do you think the replacement will continue with this struggle? What do you think, David? What's your sense?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't see that question. Can you repeat it?
I was just reading it off of. I think it comes from maybe the Spanish language side. But in any case, what do you think? What's your sense? Do you think that this dies with Thelma, or that there might be some long-term possibility that this continues, that this is now institutional? In other words, this isn't dependent on any one individual.
Oh, you're talking in terms of cracking down on corruption, yeah?
Just do we think that these cases are going to continue, regardless of whether or not someone like Thelma Aldana, who has obviously been a critical actor in this, is in the position of Attorney General? Has this become institutionalized, I guess, is the question.
I mean, I don't think Guatemala's at that level yet. I mean, I think who is at the top makes a big difference, and maybe it makes all the difference. We saw that with Claudia Paz y Paz, the former Attorney General, who really was the one who kind of turned things around. And then Thelma Aldana, surprisingly, is kind of took up the torch. But I don't see why it couldn't kind of revert back to the status quo. I think that should be pretty much from this point on the main challenge of the CICIG, right? Is not only helping to beat these cases, but creating an institution in the Attorney General's office that's able to do this on its own, and that is, as you said, it would be institutional rather than dependent on one person or another. So I think it's possible for this to become institutional, but I don't think Guatemala is at that point yet. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is the critical question going forward, because not just Thelma Aldana, but obviously the CICIG will at some point also have to depart. So I think the model is, at least the idea is, that you have a core group of people that you are working with, and that core group is your kind of it's like your untouchables model, right? You have that core group that's working hard. You see they're honest. You see they're moving forward on very difficult cases, and then you try and spread them to different parts of the institution. In the case of the Attorney General's office, or even in the case of Guatemala, into other institutions. So what we're seeing is, for example, the core group that worked with Claudia Paz y Paz. We're seeing core members of her group who now work with the CICIG. They now work with the tax administration. They now work with the Interior Ministry and other entities that are very important to be able to stop or at least slow some of this criminal and corrupt activity. So it goes beyond the Attorney General's office, and institutionalizing, I think, takes a very long time. I think that it is so fragile that it could be reversed in less than a year. I think that the fragility of the advances is far greater, than the sort of weakness that they have exposed in those that are doing these corrupt and criminal schemes. I think that those who are involved in these corrupt and criminal schemes are still incredibly strong, very well placed, and have a lot of political power. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult going forward.
Are you saying that you think a lot of the members who made up the Mafia State were never brought to justice or haven't been outed?
I don't think there's any question. There's a lot of pieces of the Mafia State that have not been outed. We have seen the top of the Mafia State outed, portions of their revenue streams outed, their means by which they try and control different parts of the government in order to protect themselves outed. But there are many, many layers to this beast, and I should add that it's not one singular beast. It is multiple. There are multiple power bases that are also competing even amongst themselves to control these corrupt and organized crime schemes. So this is a difficult thing. You could root out one or parts of one, and you could have others that could even take advantage of the fact that you've removed one in order to put themselves into a very advantageous position. So this is the fear, I think, that you see reflected in public declarations by the commissioner of the CICIG, Ivan Velázquez. I think that he has spoken publicly about this entrenchment that he sees on the part of these corrupt and criminal schemes.
Okay, good. Should we go on to the next question?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple more questions here.
Yep.
Go ahead.
There's one from Mares D about the increased sophistication of the MS-13 in El Salvador. Do you see a possibility for the MS-13 to infiltrate higher segments of society, police, military, government in the future? Or are they destined to remain a separate actor combating the public forces? And if such a shift is a possibility, could it paradoxically lead to a decrease in violence, or at least in the most visible everyday forms, in the future?
Well, I mean, thank you, Maris, for a multi-layered and difficult question. And good to have you back, because I think you've been with us first couple times we've aired. So thanks for coming back. Please come back with your questions every week, because they are difficult, to say the least. I don't know, what's your initial reaction to those, David? I think you're well positioned. You've looked at this quite a bit.
Yeah, I think their most obvious way in to corrupting any state actor, state institution, would be local state institutions, such as the mayor's offices, because those are the ones who have to deal with the gangs the most, and so they kind of have to often, come to terms with what's happening in their communities, and if they want the violence to go down, for example, they might feel more pressured to negotiate some kind of agreement, and it's not always clear what these agreements are. but it usually is in exchange for lower levels of violence that are affecting their communities. I don't see it, the gangs reaching federal office. To me, that's not a distinct threat at this point in time. Congress, obviously the presidency, the attorney general's office, I feel like it's somewhat removed from potential gang infiltration.
Obviously, you say that, yet they did have negotiations at the highest levels in El Salvador. So I would just throw that back at you.
I guess I didn't think of that as infiltration, but it is certainly, they are definitely a national actor, and they're making their influence felt at the national level. So in that sense, yeah, I think Merez, I would say yes. And I think when you asked if it would lead to lower levels of violence, I mean, we're seeing that already. Homicides are down. I think they're less than half of what they were a year ago. And that has a lot to do with the coordination of the gangs. It's something that they've done purposefully. It's not an accident. Some would say that the government is also responsible for that. It's tough to say who exactly is responsible for how much. But I do think the violence is going down for a reason, but I don't think it will necessarily stay down. I think if either the government or the gangs change their policy, that it could very easily go up again. It's kind of what we've been seeing in El Salvador over the last 4 or 5 years. The homicide rate is like a roller coaster. So I don't see any reason that it would stay stable.
I mean,
what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's such a multi-layered question. I think there are two issues here. And one has to do with violence or monopolies on violence, monopolies on coercion, and one has to do with political capital. So I think my first inclination, of course they're related. My first inclination would be we need to think about these maybe almost separately. One may lead to the other, and what do I mean by that? I mean that in the case of the MS-13 in some of their areas, what did we see in a place like Honduras? We saw that in some instances, the MS-13 had the monopoly on violence, the monopoly on coercion in certain areas. This is obviously not something that you would like to see. However, the residents of that area almost preferred the MS-13, or I would say preferred the MS-13 in some cases to other rival gangs that could have entered and been worse than the MS-13, and even in some cases to state security forces that they saw as victimizing them as much or more than the gangs themselves. So there's the question of, if they are working hand in hand with security forces, often what you can see is what I think Mauricio is talking about, this idea of increased security, or what you were mentioning, lower levels of violence. So you've got that aspect. And then you've got a whole other aspect which is related to this question of connections to the political apparatus, the ones in high office or even municipal office, so mayors, and what does that give you if you're a gang member? Well, in the case of El Salvador, we have seen that it gave them access to jobs, and they got some access to social programs or money for those social programs. And in some respects, they got some protection. There was some sort of top cover they could expect if they committed certain types of crimes, extortion being probably tops among them. I think it's harder for mayors to protect gang members from murder cases, for instance. They would need slightly better top cover than that. But certainly the impunity in many of these countries would speak to their ability to seek and obtain some sort of top cover, whether it's from the mayor or somebody else. So these are kind of two different questions. But both can lead to ironically, decreases in violence, or paradoxically, decreases in violence. Now, the long-term impact of those types of pacts can be perverse. Certainly there are manipulation of voting. There is manipulation of this question of who gets the social services or monies for educational or social programs, jobs. So these types of things can make for an uneven playing field, so to say, and certainly can open the door for a certain type of coercion that is maybe not manifestly as violent. In other words, in terms of the statistics might not show it to be as violent, but the community themselves feels as if they are in a very violent or threatening situation because of an alliance that they see with the gangs, or between the gangs and, say, the police, or between the gangs and the mayor's office. They have no recourse then. They are literally without any recourse in that sort of situation. So while it may lead to some quote unquote benefits, it comes with huge costs as well.
I think that is the dilemma. I mean, I think in the gang truce in 2012, it's hard to deny that the gangs became more organized as a result of that process. And that did lead to lower levels of violence for a relatively short amount of time. But then what were the secondary effects? What happened after that is very worrying, obviously. The gangs decided to, I feel like they understood how to use violence as a political leverage point. And they can kind of turn it on or off to a much greater degree than they used to. I think, to me, this is a little off of the question, but I think the reason, and this is kind of what I've heard from some people in El Salvador, that the gang truce ultimately failed, in that it did lead to a rebound in violence, is because there was no exit strategy, right? It was, okay, we have a truce, and then what? So what happens next? And to me, I think the only way to ensure that the violence is going to stay down is some kind of agreement that leads to a dismantling of the gang, or disbanding of the gang, or demobilization, which for a long time to me seemed completely ludicrous, seemed totally out of the question. But the MS-13 did recently reportedly make that offer to the government, which it doesn't look like the government has yet to necessarily agree on. But I think for me,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is I think probably a topic for a whole nother Facebook Live session. But the reality of that gang truce was, it was never really a gang truce. I mean, my idea of that gang truce was it was violence interruption. It was a project that should have been described and sold as violence interruption. Gang truce was too strong. They were trying to slow down the chains of retribution that exist amongst and between gangs, and to open up some political space, maybe some social space as well. and figure out some way forward. I don't think that they sold that very well, and I think that they had a near impossible dilemma that they couldn't find their way out of, which was how do we transition them? How do we slow down their criminal economies while we're transitioning them? And they didn't come up with anything. There was no clear plan, because that wasn't part of it. The initial thing was, we're going to slow down the chains of retribution. So it was, I think that's a whole another topic. I think that maybe just kind of circling back to some of the questions we have here, which are, I guess, still a little bit more focused on the Mafia State. Question about what happened with the Mafia State in Honduras, from Felix Maldonado. What do you think? You've been looking, David, at Honduras for a few years now. Is Honduras? Are we looking at the same thing? When we look at Honduras and Guatemala, is that the same thing?
Right. It's obviously such an easy comparison, right? We think of the Northern Triangle countries, and we often compare between them. And I was thinking about that when we were talking about what's going on in Guatemala, and whether we can make a similar comparison with either Honduras or El Salvador. Obviously, Honduras is a little closer. It's, to me, there is no, well, I wouldn't say there's no sign, but I would say there's not enough evidence or indications even that Honduras has become, or has recently been, a mafia state. And perhaps that's because we don't know enough yet. The MASI, which is basically the CICID equivalent in Honduras, has not yet matured. It's only been around for, I think, less than a year, or around a year. And it took the CICID a number of years before it was able to crack the case regarding Perez Molina. So I wouldn't put it outside the realm of possibility, but at the moment, I don't see it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't see it at this stage either. I think that the level of corruption that we saw, corruption and criminal activity that we saw in the Perez Molina administration, or at least appeared to see, if all the cases against them are to be believed, was just so much higher than, and so much more sophisticated than what we're seeing in some of the other countries. My sense from a place like Honduras is that there are certainly numerous corruption and organized crime schemes that have involvement from state actors. But I don't get the sense that they're so centrally organized that they have any sort of center. In fact, my overall sense with Honduras is always that what is the predominating element is chaos. I see chaos in all the different things that we've looked at in that country, and without having broken it down, or at least have the court cases to break it down like we have in Guatemala, we can say that in other criminal activities and with other criminal groups, we've seen chaos play out. Recent work we did on jails, the absolute chaos that we saw within the jail system, and the way in which it interacted with the state on so many levels, and how there wasn't any one actor that could exert control over it because it was so chaotic. The way in which the illegal arms trafficking industry works in that country. Amazing that it is almost more a crime of opportunity than a sort of systematic top-down scheme from very organized, criminal groups, which it can be. There are certainly high-level criminal groups that are working to move weapons, but it was such an equal opportunity crime. What we found when we investigated this in 2015 and 2016, the results of which we will publish in the coming weeks, is that you had essentially family members who had relatives or other family members in the United States who would take advantage of the very lax laws that exist in the United States and buy weapons, 5 to 10 weapons, and put them in shipping containers inside of washing machines or inside of cars, and then ship them to Honduras and then just sell them at a low level. Just maybe even in the neighborhood, or maybe even sell them over Facebook or WhatsApp. I mean, it was that informal a market, and it was such a high markup. You could get, what you bought in the U.S., you could get 4 or 5 times for that same weapon in Honduras. So it was just a crime of opportunity, and very chaotic. There was nothing that kind of held it together. And that's the same sense I get from Honduras, the Honduras elites, is that there's no centering unit. And certainly that is the case in all of these countries. What we had, maybe the anomaly is really Guatemala, in the sense that you had this such top-down control. I think it's really, really hard to do that. And I think the level to which they tried to do that, and maybe that's why it fell apart, and maybe that's why we know about it, is because it's so hard to do, to keep it so cohesive at the top. But I don't get that sense in Honduras. I get the sense that it's more of an equal opportunity criminal market.
I think it's important not to confuse institutional weakness, which leads to impunity and all the rest, and the enabling of criminal groups. It's important not to confuse that with a mafia state, right? Which is actually the exact opposite, which is a very organized and structured system within the government. It's not. It's very set up in a way that enables it to fulfill its functions with a very rigid, in a very rigid manner. So I think it's what we're seeing in Honduras is more the weakness of state institutions as opposed to a mafia state, which obviously can lead to some of the same results in some senses, in terms of widespread impunity for elites and for criminal groups. So
no, I agree. I don't think we can throw all these things in one huge bag and say that they're all the same. I think we need to keep an eye on the nuances and the differences, and maybe keep in mind that maybe the Guatemala case is an anomaly and not the norm. So many different competing power groups, and we can't exclude foreign actors as critical actors and determining actors. They have an incredibly powerful role. We've seen that. And we've actually got a question from one of our own, Hector Silva, who's asking us whether or not we think the Trump administration is going to continue supporting these extra national actors like the Maxi, which we should note is backed by the Organization of American States, not by the UN, and has a slightly different mandate from the CICIG in Guatemala, slightly less aggressive, I would say, in general terms, but nonetheless, a very important role in Honduras. Do we think, certainly indications so far are that the Trump administration supports these efforts? Any reason to believe that they will back away from supporting these extra national efforts to get justice in these high-level corruption and organized crime cases, David?
I think there's reason to believe it. I don't think we've seen it yet. I mean, the Trump's motto is America first, right? It's all about putting America first and making sure that our interests, or the United States interest, comes before that of any other country. I think there's two kind of distinctions to be made. One is political backing and another is financial backing, right? Even if the United States is not sending a lot of money, it can still, through bad channels or from the embassies, send a strong message that it supports either the Massey and the CICIG. So I think, but again, I think they have the Trump administration so far has shown its support. It's still early days, anything could happen. What do you think?
I think there are very good reasons to be worried, and I think that the initial declarations of what was then incoming Secretary of State Tillerson were read into. This was prior to any indications as to what kind of power he would have over the agency that he has been tasked to run. And what we have seen since is that he has had his legs cut out from underneath him. I think that there are reasons to worry because I don't get a sense that he's actually the one calling the shots all the time. And then the other part for me that is a little bit worrisome is just their seeming intention to absolutely gut the State Department, to leave it without funds, to take their message of America First so far, so much retrenchment that they leave these entities that have played incredibly important roles in these cases. They leave these entities basically on their own. And if they do not have the backing, or at least the outward, or at least the sort of seeming backing of the United States, I think that they could easily perish. I think that there are very good reasons to worry that the United States is just not gonna continue to support these efforts so overtly that by default they will have. They will end, and they will not end in ways that leave lasting impact, which is really at the end the way you want to leave them. They want to leave institutions strong, robust, and with an ability to do the work on their own. And we're still far away from that in these countries that we're talking about. We have a story today about the Attorney General's office in Honduras, and how he has been, because of all the different fronts that he's opened up, in cases that are very similar to the cases that have been opened up in Guatemala, he has been isolated. And at a certain point, there was a thought that he may even be forcibly removed. That hasn't happened, and he still has very strong support from the State Department. But what does a weakened State Department do for somebody like that in that position? That's a big question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think back to when Perez Molina renewed the CICIG's mandate in 2015, and I'm thinking under a Trump administration, would the U.S. have put the same amount of pressure on him to have renewed it, or would the U.S. be fine and to let him would it stand by and let the CICIG go out of existence? And I could definitely see the U.S. not putting up much of a fight on the part of the CICIG. So
yeah, and that would obviously I think be I think that would be a bad decision, but we'll have to see going forward. I just wanted we have a nice way to sort of round out this Facebook Live with a question that brings us full circle from our good friend Professor David Martinez Amador. Who's always running around the region and sending us nice tidbits of what he finds in his own travels. He says the Mafia State also implies a direct relation with traditional elites, right? What are the chances of Guatemala's members of the traditional economic elite also colluding or having colluded with the Reina del Sur, which is the nickname they gave to Marjorie Chacon? Is there any information on that? Will this situation finally be exposed in full?
Take
David,
it away, Steve.
You got 2 minutes. 2 minutes to round this thing out. Very tough question, David. Thank you very much. Nothing? You're not even going there?
I mean, you know, um, it's tough to say. Why would the economic elites be colluding with Chacon? Is that something that we really?
To me, yes, you bring up a good question, but it's also amazing to me how both of us, when we talk about traditional economic elites, start to fidget, move, and do our little traditional elites dance, because it is such a difficult question, and it is so dangerous on so many levels, because in so many instances there are a lot of rumors, but not a lot of evidence, and that is the case in this one as in many others from around the region. Now, what we don't see in these cases, for example, in the drug trafficking indictments, is any mention of, through what banks Chacon or Borrayo or Baldetti or López Bonilla were moving their money, for instance. I mean, that would be a question mark that I would have. And I think there are reasons why these cases don't touch those traditional elites. I think they're very difficult cases to try, and B, I just think that they are politically sensitive. There's a reason we're doing the sort of traditional elite dance right now, because they're very politically sensitive. You're talking about the people who really are, the people pulling a lot of the strings behind the scenes. And these are the people that you need to have good relationships with. So I think it's difficult on a political level to go after them, and in some instances, may be even more difficult than to go after a former interior minister and a former vice president, as crazy as it might seem. So I think we don't have a lot of hard evidence in these cases, and I think that there could be some political reasons why we don't have that evidence.
And on the question of whether this will ever be fully exposed, I don't know if it will. I mean, Chacon's sentence we don't even know how long she was sentenced to. The whole trial was conducted in secret behind closed doors. So I think that it's so sensitive that I don't think, this will ever be exposed, or at least not for quite some time.
So listen, David, thank you very much. We've rounded out our hour of Facebook Live. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you have joined us via Facebook Live, or if you join us later after we have already aired and posted this, there was a couple more questions that we didn't get to. We promised to try and get to them next week when we do another Facebook Live. I think we'll probably do it at the same time. So 4 o'clock Thursday, we're going to try and make this a pretty regular thing. We started on Friday, but now we're on Thursday. And we'll be happy to talk more about organized crime in the Americas and take your questions and comments. Thanks again, David, for all your help on this. This was great.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Take care.
All right. Signing off.